And you can imagine the complexity of the issues when a group of individuals, right, 6 or 7, can't agree on the nature of the threat, how imminent it is. So you can imagine why it's so difficult for countries and nations to come together on climate policy issues. I mean, we have an upcoming meeting in Paris, I think next month, and the U.S. is, trying to hammer out an agreement. But imagine how far apart, different countries are on this issue. And so there are lots of issues here to talk about. So I would just like to touch on a few salient ones. And I think one of the most important themes that comes out of the video is the question of uncertainty. So there is a huge amount of uncertainty, not just in the climate models about what is likely to happen. There are all kinds of scenarios, the best case scenario, the most likely scenario, the worst case scenario. And the big problem is, how do we use that information, right, to make decisions? So in some ways there's an incompatibility between scientific information and the kind of information that we need as humans, as people, to make decisions, and that was very clearly evident in this film, right? So people make decisions on a scale of years or months or maybe a few years, right? Whereas the climate models predict on a scale of decades, if not longer, right? So how do you sort of like scale down that information? So there's the scale issue that's really sort of critical to these discussions. Also, I think some of this is like fundamentally to do with human nature. We're very good at dealing with imminent short-term threats, but long, chronic, unfolding threats, that's our sort of cognitive apparatus, our systems, our politics doesn't deal with that very effectively, right?
Yeah, I think given what you're saying about these uncertainties,
Mm-hmm.
and I think through human history, it seems like you say, human nature
Yeah.
we don't want to make these drastic moves or
Right.
decisions, and we wait for the disasters to happen and then we respond.
Right. So that's a really good issue, and we see that. Peter is an archaeologist, so he studies societies over really the long term, right? And we see this repeated again and again in the historical, prehistorical record, right? The Mayans, the Easter Islanders, societies after societies that declined and went extinct from climate change and related sort of problems, right? But for the people who were experiencing these events, right? I mean, it's sort of like the frog in the boiling pot syndrome, right? When you are in the middle of this, these unfolding crises, they're so imperceptible, right? So slow, and they take place over decades and in longer time scales, that societies often have other more pressing priorities, right? And which is exactly the kind of argument we hear on the international stage. So you'll hear that from developing countries, that we have far more pressing issues of poverty and of disease, illiteracy to deal with than worry about this vague threat of climate change. So how do we deal with this issue in a scientific, rational way? And that's it's not so easy to do that. Scientific information only plays, it plays a key role, but it only plays part of the role, right? So as we saw in this film, there are all these like emotional and psychological and social factors, and the Netherlands is known for its very sort of collectivist political culture, right? So they are fairly good at dealing with these problems. They've dealt with water issues for a very long time. Water boards, so there was an official feature of from a water board. They've had them for 1,000 years almost, and very democratic, inclusive institutions, and still they are finding it difficult to come to terms with this threat. So what does it tell us about our collective ability today, internationally, to deal with this problem? So on the one hand, it makes us really sort of pessimistic in many ways, but I think there is a lot of room here for learning as well. That maybe if we can, have better communication about the uncertainty, we have better policy options, and we also saw sort of a sample of the bureaucratic inertia, right? That the Dutch are famous for that, right? And they're not certainly alone, right? In having that kind of inertia, because again, the bureaucracies are meant to preserve the status quo, right? They're not designed to be sort of quick on the feet, adapting to changes that may happen like decades or on longer time scales. So again, there's our entire sort of political system, right? Our policy making apparatus, our bureaucracies, they're all meant to foster the status quo. And here we have something that profoundly threatens the status quo. So how do you create systems that are flexible and responsive? And that's really the essence of the challenge we face today. And we realize this, right, on this very small sort of microcosm, right, in this family. And you have all these like issues, interpersonal issues that are coming out, communication issues, and ultimately they decide, right, that, well, this is something that isn't yet happening. So, well, let's sort of postpone it, and that was the decision here, and which is again not very comforting, I guess, because it's they sort of came a full circle, right? They all had all this information, they had all the various scenarios, and yet they were sort of unable to really kind of come to grips with the situation. So yeah.
When was the movie made, and why was it made? Do you know?
I couldn't actually find much information about the motive for the. Maybe Stephen, would you like to speak to that? About
When and why?
the director.
2006.
See, I didn't.
Yeah, it was made into but
2006.
yeah, I think it's
Filmed in 05, but I saw at the end, it's
Yeah.
in 06.
06
So before Sandy.
before Sandy.
Sandy hit.
Yeah, I think they used the Katrina as their sort of reference point in a variety of ways, right? So yeah, definitely before Sandy doesn't find mention in the film, but it's really like it's sort of it's it is autobiographical, and I mean they are facing this threat themselves, and so I wasn't able to find other information or possible motives.
No, I didn't really have a lot of information available to me except for really a
Mhm.
minor in the DVD describing the film. I don't
Mhm.
know what the motivation was in making the film, except for the fact that
He's a
Dutch
filmmaker.
and he's a filmmaker and he lives in a town that's subject to flooding. So maybe that was, he has all those reasons probably to make a film on this topic. But there wasn't really a lot of information as to the background.
Yeah.
Go first. I'm just going to follow up with
You found the film through an international catalog, or is it one
Well,
that's popular?
I came across the film. They had a film screening in Washington, D.C., I think sponsored by the Dutch Embassy. And I found it on the internet description, and it sounded to me very interesting. And that's what got me thinking that it may be good for a film shown here at Montclair.
Wow.
That was how I came across it.
Well, I can add to that, it was indeed filmed in 2005 and broadcast in 2006 after it was edited, because that was shown actually. But the movie, I think, was made to create awareness.
Mm-hmm.
It was shown on the NCRV, which is one of the stations over there.
Okay.
So I think it was shown, I have to ask
Mhm.
my family if they saw it or not. But it was to create awareness, not only within his own family, but
Right.
by broadcasting it
Right.
for everybody else
Right.
to see. And since 2005, they had identified the weak links, so to speak. The program's called Weak Links.
Mm-hmm.
If you translate that, and in the dikes and in the sea wall and the sea defense.
Mm-hmm.
So they have undertaken steps to repair the weak links,
Yeah.
to make the walls higher, the sea defense
Mm-hmm.
needed repair, especially in that area. And this is the area he lives in. So they have done many things. Is it enough? That's another
Right.
question.
Right. Right.
So,
Is that land all as Eversea? Is it all reclaimed land?
no, where they were was not reclaimed, but
Even though it is classified,
even right around there, that area
Uh,
is reclaimed.
It is called a polder, right, which is reclaimed land. So that's how they do. Yeah, polder. Yeah, yeah.
They,
Ilpen Dam,
yeah,
you know,
right
that's
on
the.
the edge of things,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Right,
yeah.
right,
Right, it was all in there.
right.
Any other questions?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for doing this whole series. I think it's very interesting. Can you talk more about the program or the, whatever it's called, that's coming to Paris next month?
Oh, so this is these are multilateral talks. You know, these are different countries that will be meeting in Paris. President Obama has already, you know, has been sounding very sort of proactive on trying to come up with an agreement on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that is the focus of the meeting. But again, you know, what we saw in this video is, so basically there are two ways of dealing with climate change. We can look at mitigation, which is essentially, you know, trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions so as to reduce the extent of warming that we are expecting to see, right? The other part is about adaptation, because we know that even if we stopped all greenhouse gas emissions today, there is some degree of warming that will take place. So we do have to adapt to, you know, that expected warming. So sea level rise is kind of like a second order change that ensues from temperature increase. So temperature increases, and it was mentioned in the film how the oceans expand and the, you know, melting of the ice caps. So what do we do with the warming that is expected to take place, even if we come to an agreement, you know, next month in Paris on reducing greenhouse gas emissions? So adaptation and mitigation have to go hand in hand. Clearly, you know, we can't adapt to extreme case scenarios if carbon dioxide, you know, emissions were to keep growing like they are now. So action is needed on both fronts, right? We need to do something to reduce our emissions, but at the same time, we need to be also able to adapt, especially in situations like, you know, in the Netherlands, in Bangladesh, in Maldives, in many Pacific islands, which are almost at sea level or slightly above sea level. So these are countries that are most at risk from rising concentrations of carbon dioxide. So hopefully, you know, there will be some agreement. But again, the developed countries and developing countries are still not on the same page.
Obama will be there?
Obama will be there, and he's sounding very optimistic, actually, that, you know, so maybe, you know, there are probably like backroom negotiations, and China is, especially because China is now the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, has shown some willingness to come to an agreement. The problem, though, is that we have already, like, we are now at 400 parts per million in terms of carbon dioxide concentration, which is twice as much as was the case before the Industrial Revolution began, right? We're around under 200 parts per million, right? So we have doubled our carbon dioxide concentration in the last 200 or so years, 250 years maybe, right? So if we continue along this path, it doesn't matter how many floating houses we build or how many, you know, piles we put in place, it will not be sufficient to help us adapt. So clearly we need to switch to alternate forms of energy, reduce, you know, our fossil fuel dependence. So that is clearly needed. But also what is needed is adaptation. And again, you know, it's a sobering thought that the Dutch are having these issues, these problems, right? Financial, technological. So imagine Bangladesh, which is a country of 300 million people, right? So if that was to come underwater, right? So what would happen to these refugees, right? 300 million of them. So that's a very large number of people. And they clearly don't have a fraction of the technological or financial resources that the Dutch do. So I think the utility of this video goes beyond Netherlands, and it sort of illustrates, you know, some of these more complicated issues that are involved.
This is a big global problem because it affects everyone.
Yeah.
Bangladesh is flooded, and you have 300 million refugees. I mean, you just see all these hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees.
Right.
And how it's causing a problem internationally, in Europe and other places.
Right.
Imagine how larger scale problem this
Right.
in the future.
Right. And, you know, in climate studies, you know, that's exactly. So I think the issue really is that if even some of the more sort of middling scenarios come to fruition, not the worst case scenarios, but sort of the middle scenarios, even then it would be a problem unprecedented in scale and scope. and we don't have the mechanisms in place, as we are seeing now with the Syrian refugees, right? So imagine, just multiply that by, by magnitude of, I don't know, 10 or 100, or, so it would be something that would be completely unprecedented.
Do you think, Dr. Vedwan, there's a greater false sense of security in Holland maybe than in this country because they have a long history of resisting water and
Right.
because the government's written into their constitution?
Yeah, so, yeah, that's,
The water safety?
yeah. So that's a very interesting point, actually, and I was, as I was looking for sort of information on the video, I came across this article which was published in Social Studies of Science in 2007 that compared the risk culture in the two countries, the US and Netherlands. And the Dutch, quite, contrary to what we may think, that, they would have developed a greater tolerance for risk, actually are much more risk averse than Americans in terms of how they handle flooding and how they handle, storm surges and such. So in planning, for instance, when we construct dikes or levees in the US, we actually plan the levees with 1 in 100 year flood in mind. So flood, that was expected to happen once in a century, right? So that's what our levees are designed to withstand. In Netherlands, they design their levees or their dikes to withstand 1 in 10,000 year events, right? So we're talking about a much lower risk threshold. So they are acutely sensitive, right? Well, because it's a very watery landscape, right? As you saw from the right, and they are at the sea level. They don't have the luxury of sort of ignoring the threat from water, right? So that sort of thing is built into their apparatus, and they have what is called the Delta Law, so which mandates, it's a legal requirement that they build their their dikes, keeping in mind that 1 in 10,000 year level of risk. So yeah, so they are actually ahead of the U.S. in that sense, because again, the U.S. is a very diverse country. Of course, we have deserts and mountains. They don't, right? So they have to deal with this on a daily basis, and here we don't, except for the people who got directly affected, and that was one of the reasons why when Katrina happened, it took a while for it to resonate with the wider population, right? Because again, it was seen as a local issue, not as something that affected the country at large. Yeah.
I don't understand what you just said.
Uh-huh.
If you're saying 1 in 10,000,
Yeah.
I would think you'd say 1 in 10.
No.
And then the other way,
No.
it doesn't make sense to me.
No. Okay, 1 in 10,000 means that an event of such great magnitude that it happens only 1 in 10,000 years, once in 10,000 years, right? So we're talking about a humongous, huge storm. So the levee should be constructed as to withstand that magnitude of a storm, right? So that would mean that it's very strong, tall, dikes, right? Because we're talking about a much rarer event than in the U.S., which would be 1 in 100 year event, which would be of a smaller magnitude, right? Because of course, 1 in 10,000 event would be completely off the charts, right? Then a 1 in 100, which would be, of course, of a lesser magnitude than a 1 in, or of a greater magnitude than 1 in 10 year event, right? So we plan our, so that was the often heard claim when Katrina happened and all the disaster, that the levees there were of course, there were other issues with the levees not having been maintained and stuff like that, but also a part of it was that they were that Katrina was actually greater, the magnitude of it was greater than a 1 in 100 year storm. And remember, all these predictions are based on past historic patterns, right? So, and the assumption is that the climate models were, when we talk about 1 in 100 year event, that's based on historical data, right? But if that is not a guide to how things are going to unfold, then sort of all bets are off in many ways, right? So in these situations, we have what is called the precautionary principle. So we tend to go with the sort of more pessimistic scenario. But then, as we saw in the video, it's not easy to adopt the precautionary principle. It takes, it costs a lot of money, and there are there are problems involved. It sounds good in theory, but it's not so attractive in practice. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not only the sea levels
Mm-hmm.
are rising, but also sometimes the rivers are flooding.
Rivers,
We
yeah.
know all about that in this area.
Right.
So, also in the Netherlands, they
Yeah.
had river flooding in 2006, 2007.
Yeah.
That was the last time, and now they are making room for the river
dredging the,
the
yeah.
outer banks for the
Yeah.
river. It's just farmland or
Mhm.
land where cattle can be, but they're not building there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So there's actually room for the river to go.
Yeah.
For the water to go.
Yeah, floodplains, yeah, so,
Floodplains.
yeah, they evacuating,
So
yeah.
they are changing the way they build, and they're, even putting houses or farms up
Mm-hmm.
higher.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's a problem here as well. But, where does the money go? It's, when I came here, Willowbrook Mall in this area was completely underwater. I could not believe my eyes, coming from the Netherlands.
Right.
I thought, wow, this must be once in a lifetime.
Yeah.
Thing. I mean, the Americans, they could put people on the moon. This is my idea. The Americans can do
Right.
anything. But they
Right.
couldn't prevent this from happening. And all these poor people with their houses all flooded. in
Yeah.
the area. So I live in Wayne, so know all about that. But then I was totally surprised if they would let it happen again and again without doing anything. That just blew my mind.
See, that, yeah, I think that's,
Not just
yeah,
the sea or the ocean waters, it's also,
rains and, yeah.
yes.
And I think that speaks to a very important difference between the national cultures in the two countries. The Netherlands have had a more collectivist orientation to handling these events, so the government takes a much greater, central role in these events, whereas here, risk has been sort of privatized and individualized. So that has been the traditional sort of approach in the U.S. So again, it's keeping in, sort of fits with the political culture in the two countries, even though the Netherlands is also moving in a neoliberal direction now. So they are kind of like, moving the same direction. But again, there are substantial differences, I think, in how the government sees its role, right? I mean, here, insurance. I mean, if you think about what happened after Sandy, the insurance rates actually went through the roof for beachfront property. And that was, in fact, one way in which, risk was, monetized. So people were basically discouraged from buying, flood-prone property. But the government sort of played a role by actually withdrawing subsidies, because so flood insurance is heavily subsidized in the U.S. So the government can actually ensure that by just withdrawing, by playing a relatively passive role, by withdrawing subsidies, that some of the sort of the riskiest places are not built upon or are not inhabited. So that was starting to take place. But again, there are also powerful lobbies, like real estate lobbies here, which don't want that to happen, because that is prime land. So again, there is all this sort of push and pull that goes on, and that's why we have very powerful interests in this country that want to deny climate change, and because they envision that it's not going to be in their interest if the government starts acting on some of these plans.
Any more questions? Do you have anything else you want to add?
Well, I enjoyed the movie. I hope you did too, and so I think it's a good starting point for delving into some of these issues, and I think what I found sort of most interesting was that the discussions on climate change happen to be so, pardon the pun, so dry, like usually, right? So you have all these cost benefits and policy this, but here we find group of people, right, who are trying to deal with it within the constraints of their lives and their circumstances. So I think I think it should be, it has a powerful message, I think, and it could get people who are otherwise not interested in climate change or see it as a sort of an exotic, alien issue. I think it could bring those people into the dialogue and into the discussion.